On today's World Insight, the Israel-Palestine conflict escalates to its worst in years. The ICRC's regional director for the Middle East explains how to end this vicious cycle of humanitarian crises. And the EU begins its anti-subsidy investigation against Chinese electric vehicle exports. Is this an opening salvo in a new trade war?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Amidst the exchange of gunfire between Israel and Hamas, horrified civilians flee the hail of bullets and mortar shells. The number of casualties on both sides in conflict continues to rise despite the best efforts of residents to protect themselves and their loved ones. People are both physically and mentally injured. On the latest humanitarian crisis, I talked to Fabrizio Carboni, ICRC's regional director for the Middle East. For more on the humanitarian crisis, we are joined by Fabrizio Carboni, who is the ICRC regional director for the Middle East. Mr. Carboni, what a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for taking your time out of, I would assume, very busy schedule right now.
Yes, very. But thank you for having me in your show.
What is your latest assessment of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, especially the Gaza area?
Look, I mean, it's really important to stress that we have a humanitarian perspective on this crisis. And there is a huge feeling of sadness and shock and frustration. Shock because what we've seen over the last days is really unthinkable. The level of violence, the civilians who were affected. I mean, we saw the images of the attack in Israel, and now we're seeing also the civilians in Gaza going through this intense military operation. And what is frustrating is that as humanitarian, we repeatedly said that if there is no political solution to the crisis, we will face again and again new humanitarian crisis. And that's where we are today.
Is it like yesterday once more for you? I mean, you have been having very rich experience in the region, and this is the fear you've been having over the past few years. And when it became a reality, sadly, what was it like for you?
I mean, for us, obviously, the first thing, it's our own staff. You know, we have a lot of staff in Gaza, we have a lot of staff in Israel, and the first action is to think about our staff, see if they are safe, because if our staff is not safe, we cannot operate, we cannot respond to the crisis. Then the second reaction after the shock of what happened is to quickly start thinking about what we can do as a humanitarian actor, and especially a humanitarian actor who has been in Israel and occupied territory for many decades. So action was directly for us the main priority. And we had different line of work. The first one was obviously related to the people who were captured, taken to Gaza, and directly establish contact with all authorities in Gaza and around, for us to play our role, our legal role, to access people, ask authority to allow people to give answer to their family, to inform their family,
right,
and to make sure that they are treated humanly.
Yeah. So normally speaking, what is likely to be the procedure if there were cases of so-called hostage taken? So for ICRC, what are some of the normal procedures for you to work with all parties? Can you maybe go through some of the major structures of your work line?
Sure. I mean, what we don't do, we don't negotiate the release of detainees, because we are a humanitarian actor, and from our perspective, there is no negotiation to take place. Once parties decide to release either detainees, like we did in Yemen a couple of months ago, where we, took part in the release of thousands of detainees. We organize the humanitarian release of those people, and so we contact both parties to make sure that there is an agreement on the people who are going to be released. We make sure that the people are willing to go back and that they are in good condition to travel. And then with the parties, we make sure that the security in the field allow us to do our humanitarian work, which is to bring people back to their place. But this procedure is all around the world. That's how we work in Colombia, in Yemen, in Israel, in occupied territory, if needed.
Mr. Carboni, what about the other side of the story? According to the Israeli defense minister, the blockade of Gaza is going to include almost everything, huge impact on the civilian. For example, about the bans on the emission of food, electricity, and fuel, and the list goes on. So what does that mean for the civilians over there? What have been your operations like over there as well? How are you trying to contact the Israeli side, for example, in order to make sure there can be better access of living necessities for the common people there?
It's really important to know that Gaza, even without this latest round of violence, is a place which is very fragile and which has seen several rounds of violence. So the starting point for the people in Gaza is already very low. For us, it's clear that civilian population needs to be protected and have access to essential services. And we've made already clear to all parties that you cannot prevent essential services to be provided to the civilian population in Gaza. So this is a dialogue which is ongoing. Now we need to acknowledge that there is this military operation ongoing, but the military operation cannot be at the expense of access to essential services for the civilian population. And I would like also to add an element which is often not spoken about. It's the psychological impact of this violence. You have a population who in Gaza just cannot leave Gaza. They are stuck there. And they've seen already several rounds of violence. And you have children, you have fathers and mothers who there's nothing they can do except wait and hope that they won't be targeted or be next to a target of a military operation. I'm sure you can imagine the psychological toll for all those families, for all those people in Gaza who are simply desperate and terrified by what's happening.
Hope is in deficit at this moment. Whether it's about resolving this conflict or for the common folks in Gaza. And one could also argue for common folks in Israel as well. When you have your operations both in Israel and in the Palestine area, as well as other parts of the Middle East, and many of them would develop sympathy, empathy toward the local community, and they should rightly so. How would you reconcile these different calls and discussions within your organization about what to do?
Look, I really thank you for your question, because you're asking probably what is the most challenging part in our work in Israel and occupied territory. As you said, for us as humanitarian actor, I cannot rank pain and misery. Okay, I'm sorry, but a mother is a mother, and I don't care on which side of the border she is. If she loses her son, if she is anxious about finding food, for me, it doesn't matter. That's a starting point. As a humanitarian actor, as a neutral humanitarian actor who works on frontline, who works in the middle of conflict, we cannot rank pain. This being said, when it comes to our action, obviously we will assist according to needs, and we cannot ignore that in some places there are more resources than others. I mean, it's obvious that on Israeli side there are more resources to assist the people who were victims of this violence. But it doesn't mean that I don't share this pain, and that doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge the suffering of those people. And I think this is really important. And the last point, all conflicts are highly politicized. And Israel and the situation in occupied territory is no exception. And for us as humanitarian actors, we need to do whatever we can to disconnect ourselves from this political process. Not that it doesn't matter. Actually, we believe that the only solution is a political solution. But as humanitarian actor, if we are tainted by this political environment, we will lose access to people. We will not be in a position to go in the prisons, to be in the field, to assist people. And so it's very, very important for us, and it's really hard to navigate this space, this humanitarian neutral space, to avoid being politicized. And it's very hard. It's very hard. Doesn't mean that it's easy for us as individual. As individual, we all have opinion. But when I'm an ICRC worker, I only focus on what it takes to assist and protect people according to their needs.
You know, Mr. Carboni, I totally understand what you're trying to talk about, especially for a conflict. For people on both sides, morally speaking, it could be easier, or ethically speaking, it could be easier, quote unquote, to choose a side. And yet, for someone like you and your colleagues of this organization, you have to stand with both sides, and you have to guard the interests of both sides, knowing that there are wrongdoings from either of the side. There are also sufferings from either of the sides. So I totally understand what you're saying, but the Middle East, we have seen over the past 2 years some dim hope of different groups coming to some degrees of reconciliation and understanding, and even establish diplomatic relations. But now, how do you see this latest conflict likely to throw the region into something that we don't understand yet?
Look, in the ICRC, we've been in this region for decades. And if I look at the last 15 years, the conflict in Syria, the conflict in Yemen, the conflict in Iraq, the situation in Israel and occupied territory, also the instability we saw in Lebanon. I mean, the level of violence is unthinkable. And from a strictly humanitarian point of view, what we see is that the use of force and the security agenda without an agenda which addresses the root causes of violence, a use of force which disregards basic humanitarian principle, we haven't seen yet such a thing leading to a more stable and peaceful environment. What we fear and what we've said publicly repeatedly, only the security agenda, to have only a security perspective on crisis, political crisis, won't solve the problem, won't address it. And so we will have maybe a couple of years of stability, but at one stage, you'll have instability, you'll have violence again. And that's what we see. We need a political solution. And political solution implies also conceding. And we don't see this for the time being. And we're talking today about Israel and occupied territory, and on record we've said repeatedly that we need to address the situation of occupation. We need to address the roots of this crisis and conflict, which are political.
Right.
Humanitarian actors, we don't solve political problems. We buy time, we try to keep people afloat in order for politics with a capital P, to find solutions. And the problem is that it's not happening. And as humanitarian actors, it's getting more and more difficult to respond to the humanitarian crisis, because there is also an additional dimension which is often underestimated. It's the climate crisis, which comes on top of this violence and instability. And so the needs become overwhelming, and there is a necessity to go back to politics and find solutions and have the courage, the political courage, to find solutions.
We are likely to see more escalation of tensions and conflicts and use of arms and forces in the coming days, and probably even longer than that. So to you, how can you get prepared for that?
You know, first, and I'm happy that you asked me this question, we need support from states of goodwill. And the support we need is the acknowledgement that we need humanitarian organization like the ICRC, neutral organization, impartial, and an organization which is in the field. And I think, it's really important for me to have this opportunity to talk on Chinese television, to really ask for this support. And I know we have it, but it's always important to remind the necessity to have such an organization like the ICRC. We're taking huge risk,
right,
personal risk, to be present. Then to be ready, what we do is obviously to pre-position as much as we can stocks and resources and human resources. And then it's our dialogue with states and parties to the conflict, to remind them that we need a humanitarian space. Actually, people in for instance, Gaza today need to have a humanitarian space where they can be evacuated if they are wounded, to have access to hospital, right, to receive basic services. So today we prepare for the worst, hoping for the best.
I see. My final question for you. We are living in a world of social media, echo chamber, so to speak. And you see how the world is divided, very much so, not only where you are, the rest of the world as well, about the conflict going on in your region. So what is the best way for the public to understand exactly what's going on and be able to do some soul searching before they speak?
I think that if there is a message, is the cause of your fight might be legitimate, but the way you use force has limits. And even if your cause is just, you're not allowed to do whatever you want. And you still need to respect basic principle of humanity. Your cause doesn't justify everything in humanitarian terms. I think people need to have this clear distinction between the reason why you believe you are entitled to fight and the way you fight.
Fabrizio Carboni, ICRC's Regional Director for the Middle East. All the best to you and your colleagues in the region, of course, the people there as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're watching World Insight. Coming up, an EU anti-subsidy probe into Chinese electronic vehicles is underway. Is this an opening salvo in a new trade war?